Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to COS at Home. I am your host, Jonathan Viod, and I really appreciate you joining us for another exciting program. Tonight, we will be discussing the COS why the COS resolution is the superior option when it comes to Article 5, share details on a new contest available, and answer two very important questions during our mailbag segment. For our interview segment, we will be joined by American law professor and scholar, Professor Randy Barnett of Georgetown University. But first, for anyone that is new to the show and new to Convention of States, I'd like to welcome you to our organization. We are a grassroots movement focused on the goal of utilizing Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution to call a convention for proposing amendments to the Constitution that would reduce the size and scope of the federal government, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, and place term limits on all members of Congress and federal officials. In order to hold this convention, we need 34 states to pass our resolution, and so far we have 19 states that have done this. So again, thank you so much for joining us. You're joining the movement at a great time, and we're happy that you are here. Now it's time for 5 for 5. All right, so tonight for 5 for 5, we will cover why the Convention of States resolution is the preferred method for holding a convention that would solve the problems created by the federal government. That's an Article 5 convention. There are a lot of Article 5 movements out there, some that have been around for decades. So why do we believe that the Convention of States' proposal is better than the others? Well, first, let's take you back to the very first year that Convention of States existed, when we visited the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, to hear from tonight's guest, Professor Randy Barnett.
I have to admit that when I was first on a conference call with Mark and Mike, and I was hearing about this proposal for the first time, I hadn't read anything about it, and they were getting ready to tell me what the subject matter of this convention was. I was getting ready to not like it. I thought the chances of this, whatever was going to come next in this phone call, being something that was going to meet my standards for what I think a convention should be about, was extremely low. And then they read it to me, and then I said, that's perfect. That's nearly perfect. I mean, that is as perfect as I think you can get in terms of defining what the proper scope of such a convention should be. For calling the Convention of the States limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution of the United States that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. So that is the proposal. That's why I think this proposal, of all the Article 5 proposals that I've seen, is better. It's better than my own Bill of Federalism. My own Bill of Federalism with the 10 amendments, too many moving parts, too complicated. Everybody's going to like one and object to the other, as well as the fact that if you try to commit yourself to language up front, people are going to start picking the language apart. And in fact, they might be right to do so. But you're stuck with the language that you've picked because it's all been front-loaded. So you have to have a convention that deliberates over language just the way you deliberate. The federal Constitution gives you authority to do this. Now the question is, will you use the authority that the federal Constitution gives you to restore the Constitution that was given to us by the Founding Fathers and by those who wrote the amendments to the Constitution that we already have? That's your responsibility. Thanks.
Some excellent comments there from Professor Barnett, and I'm really looking forward to showing you our conversation with him later this evening. But there are two things in particular, two key factors in what separates COS from the rest of the Article 5 movement, and you heard Professor Barnett talking about some of them. First is that our resolution is not focused on specific amendments. Rather, we have three subject matters that I mentioned at the top of the program, right? And Professor Barnett also highlighted them in his discussion. This allows the convention to deal with the structural issues within our government and not focus on one narrow issue like a balanced budget or term limits. As the late, great Dr. Tom Coburn observed, when you are diagnosed with an illness, you don't treat the symptoms, you treat the disease. The COS resolution does exactly that. And as Professor Barnett said, because our resolution talks about subject matters and doesn't have specific amendments, we're not then being picked apart by opposition when it comes to those amendments. We give the legislators the ability to or I should say, the commissioners to the convention, the ability to draft and model the legislation and have a debate on the floor about that. And it's not happening before we get there and having to argue about those specific amendments. In addition to that, the second key factor is that this is a grassroots movement, which means we, the people, are responsible for the success. Many other movements simply focus on legislators and passing their resolutions without support from the people or from the grassroots. Unless you have deep pockets and high-powered lobbyists registered in every state of the union, this plan is doomed to fail. And we have to ask ourselves, do we want an effort to call a convention that avoids working with the people directly to really be successful? Will that ultimately succeed in turning our nation around? Personally, I don't think it will, which means the COS model, the one that lies with the people, is clearly the preferred method and the one that has the better chance of success. Okay, let's hear about the latest COS news from across the country. And to do that, I will turn it over to producer G with COS Now.
What do we want? When do we want it?
In these dog days of summer, volunteer patriots for Convention of States have been spreading the word about Article 5 of the Constitution and its unique power to change D.C. forever. Here's a selection of recent snapshots from grassroots events going on around the country, including from Nebraska, Maryland, Tennessee, Maine, New York, Michigan, and Virginia. In response to a local columnist claiming that Ohioans were suspicious of Convention of States, the COS Ohio volunteer team published a response, noting that a recent survey by Susquehanna Research revealed that 76% of Ohio voters support the Convention of States solution and its goals. COS Ohio writes in part, quote, "We the people have a unique and powerful tool waiting in the wings that can affect real change in Washington, utilizing a safe, civil, and constitutional process. Currently under consideration in the Ohio House is the Convention of States Resolution, HJR 3. Former President Donald Trump announced his pick for Vice President would be Convention of States supporter and Ohio U.S. Senator J.D. Vance. This news comes just 2 days after an assassination attempt on the life of the former president at a rally in western Pennsylvania. COS Ohio volunteer Patrick Clote was an eyewitness to this historic event, and he appeared on this week's Battle Cry to share his spellbinding story.
Looked at it, I said, gosh, that doesn't make any sense that, you would have people out of the venue having sight into the arena. It didn't make any sense to me, and Becky, my wife, also mentioned that. So we're sitting there watching, and finally you could see something going on. There was some activity over there. And a person that had been near the fence walks over, and in front of us is 3 Secret Service agents. And she says to them, hey, they're screaming over there. There's a guy on the roof with a gun.
You can watch that full interview at conventionofstates.com/battlecry. Last week, President Biden announced a 3-pronged proposal to radically reform the Supreme Court, including term limits for the Supreme Court. Reacting to the plan on Flashpoint, here's Convention of States President Mark Meckler.
Yeah, I think the main thing that we're seeing here is an absolute unadulterated attack on the legitimacy of the Supreme Court like we haven't seen since FDR. It's really dangerous. On the issue of term limits for the Supreme Court, I'm not necessarily opposed to that. Convention of States, that's available under a Convention of States. That's the way to do it, call a Convention of States. What he's actually trying to do is undermine a sitting Supreme Court that is largely conservative. He wants to impose these term limits now, not grandfather anyone in, so that he can remove sitting conservative Supreme Court justices.
In addition, Article 5 scholar and longtime professor Robert G. Nadelson entered his own response to Biden's plan, arguing that any kind of term limits for SCOTUS would need to be balanced with term limits for Congress. He goes on to write, quote, "A term limits amendment is unlikely to obtain the 2/3 approval of both the Senate and the House of Representatives necessary for submission to the states for ratification. That means it will have to be proposed, as provided in the Constitution, by a convention of the states." Appearing at a family leader event in Iowa, Rick Santorum called on state lawmakers to use their constitutional power and take immediate action.
Now, how many in this room, raise your hand if you believe that Congress is going to propose amendments to limit its power and authority? Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you think if they're going to pass an amendment that limits their terms. Raise your hand if they're going to pass an amendment that's going to limit their power to spend. or tax. And yet, there is a provision in the Constitution that allows the entities that are actually governing as conservatives to gather and propose amendments to put restraint on the federal government without the federal government having any say in those amendments. I think this is America's last best hope. It is the one the founders gave us for such a time as this. And if we don't use it, we will be that generation who not only lost America, but were too cowardly to take up the cudgel to save it. I don't want to be counted in that number, and I hope Iowa doesn't either. Thank you and God bless.
And now, you're up to date with Convention of States.
What do we want? When do we want it?
So many great things in that, and thank you, Producer G, for capturing all of the amazing things that are going on across the nation. Ohio, you should be really excited to be featured so heavily in there. A lot of good things happening there. There were, though, a few things that we weren't able to squeeze into that update. One is that we have a new endorser of Convention of States. Congressman Pat Fallon from Texas's 4th Congressional District is a new endorser of Convention of States. We're very excited to have Congressman Fallon's endorsement. You actually may have seen him fairly recently when they were having a hearing with the former Director of the Secret Service, Kimberly Cheadle. He was the gentleman who said that she should go back to guarding Doritos. So we're very excited to have Congressman Fallon's endorsement and support of Convention of States. And shout out to our Texas team, particularly State Director Erica Hatfield, for helping us secure that endorsement. A number of our leaders have done this over the years, reaching out to congressmen. We've had our state director from Missouri, Brett Sturley, help us with getting an endorsement. Our state director in Oklahoma, John Gwynn, helping us get an endorsement. You can help us out as well out in the audience, too. If you have a relationship with some of these legislators or influential people out in conservative media, definitely connect us with them, and we will reach out to them, and hopefully they will come on as endorsers of Convention of States. The other thing I want to mention is that just the last few days, and in fact, I think they were on their way home today, we had staff members, including Mark Meckler, Mike Farris, Rita Peters, Rick Santorum, some of our regional directors, out at the National Conference for State Legislatures out in Louisville, Kentucky. We had a really great response there and made some important contacts and relationships with legislators. You want to check out our social media feed for some of the information on that. And I'm sure Producer G will be covering that and so much more in the next edition of COS Now. Okay, so now we're going to go on to our interview segment. Unfortunately, I hate doing this. As often as possible, we want this to be a live show, but we had to sit down with Professor Randy Barnett ahead of time. So this is a pre-recorded interview that we're going to be having. So we won't be able to have a question and answer session from you out in the audience. Nevertheless, I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. Professor Barnett just is an incredible patriot. And I really enjoyed the conversation that I had with him about Article 5, originalism, the Supreme Court, so much more. So check it out as we get it started right now. We have the great pleasure of welcoming the Patrick Hotung Professor of Constitutional Law at Georgetown University Law Center and the Director of the Constitution at Georgetown Center for the Constitution, Professor Randy Barnett. Professor Barnett, how are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great. It's a beautiful day here in Central Virginia, and looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you so much. And Professor Barnett, I have to say, it's really exciting to have you with us. And, you know, whenever I have a new guest to COS at Home, I typically ask them to tell us their COS story. But as a law professor and having the background that you do, I would imagine that since you revere the Constitution and you've studied this for a number of years, that perhaps you have a broader story about Article 5 and what brought you to that second method of Article 5 to proposing amendments to the Constitution. So when did you first start to believe that this was something that could be the solution to the problems that ail our country?
Well, actually, the story is a very specific one. after the Tea Party movement got started, and I was a big fan of the Tea Party movement, which I considered to be the first and in my lifetime, really the only grassroots movement that had been formed around the idea of restoring the lost Constitution, of respecting the Constitution. And it was both a small L libertarian movement, but it was mostly a big C constitutionalist movement. And as it was getting its legs and starting to exert some political force, state legislators around the country started passing what's known as state sovereignty resolutions, in which they claimed that their states were sovereign. They sometimes claimed the power to nullify federal laws, which in my view, states do not have under our federal union. And these things, my feeling about this was and this was done at the behest of the Tea Party, but it was also done to satisfy or mollify the Tea Party. And my feeling about that at the time was this was just symbolism over substance, as Rush Limbaugh used to say. These resolutions would have no legal effect under our constitutional system, both the way it should be and the way it is. States do not have the power to nullify laws, regardless of what sovereignty they may claim for themselves. They're limited sovereigns within our system of government. But it occurred to me as I was fielding questions from reporters about state sovereignty amendments or resolutions that states actually did have a constitutional power that they could exert if they wanted to. And that is the power to call for an amendments convention. And you'll notice I don't call it a constitutional convention. The Constitution refers to it as a convention for purposes of proposing amendments. It's an amendments convention. And it occurred to me, state legislatures, not even involving the governors of their state legislatures themselves were given a power under our Constitution to call for an amendments convention in which the Constitution would be amended. That's a real power. It's in the Constitution. And so I decided that one thing I could do to sort of give the Tea Party something to be for, as apart from these meaningless symbolic resolutions, was to propose an amendment that could be adopted by an Article 5 convention. And I did that in a Wall Street Journal op-ed. I proposed what I called a federalism amendment. It was a multi-part amendment to try to restore constitutional federalism. But, in all honesty, it was something I put together in several days. You devote a few days to an op-ed. You don't devote more time than that. It got a huge response. It got more response than all my other Wall Street Journal op-eds put together. And I've written many op-eds at that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. And I got some interest, in particular from a gentleman named Michael Patrick Leahy, who now is a journalist in Tennessee, but who was then involved in the Tea Party movement and had the precursor of a video podcast. Before there were video podcasts, there were internet television shows. And he had an internet television show, a Tea Party television show, and he had me on as a guest. And he wanted to talk about the federalism amendment. And I said, I'm happy to. And I talked about it. And he said, well, let's go to town and let's do this thing. And I said, hey, well, wait a second. I spent a few days working this up. I'm sure it needs more thought. We said, well, how much time do you need? So, this is all done on, live TV. And I said, well, a couple of weeks. He said, okay, we'll have you on back. We'll have you back on. And so over the next couple of weeks, maybe I can't remember how many weeks it was, I wrote ultimately what became the Bill of Federalism, which appeared on Forbes.com. If you Google Randy Barnett, Bill of Federalism, Forbes.com, you can still see the 10 constitutional amendments that I proposed to be considered by an Article 5 convention. And the reason I went from 1 amendment to 10 amendments is I was trying to pursue a strategy of coalitions, creating a coalition. There were a lot of different ideas that came to me as a result of that Tea Party appearance. And rather than try to put them all into a single omnibus amendment, which any one of those pieces could sink the whole thing, I thought it would be more efficacious to create separate amendments, and those that got adopted would get adopted, and those that didn't that wouldn't get adopted. The first Congress proposed 12 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, only 10 of which got adopted initially. That's what we know as the Bill of Rights. So that was my strategy, and that's how I got involved in the Article 5 process. What happened after that, I describe in the book. I have a chapter devoted to the repeal amendment. One of the 10 amendments that I had proposed was to give states the power to repeal any federal law. In a sense, it was to give them a power of nullification that the Constitution did not give them, to provide a state check on federal power. And the way the amendment would work is that a supermajority of the state legislatures could get together, 2/3 of the state legislatures could get together and propose and repeal any federal law or regulation. If this amendment was passed, it would be in the Constitution that 2/3 of the state legislatures could vote to repeal any federal law or regulation. Of course, Obamacare was now in the works, and that would have been one of them, but that was certainly not the only thing that would have been served by the repeal amendment. That was one of the 10 proposals. I was contacted by the Virginia Tea Party movement, and I had several conference calls with them. That's how they, governed themselves in those days, and about what they should get behind. And it was those Virginia Tea Partiers that chose the repeal amendment as the one that most appealed to them. And from there, we formed an organization. I tried to raise money for it. Eventually, the repeal amendment was introduced into both houses of Congress. Rob Bishop of Utah introduced it in the House, and it was introduced into the Senate as well. And that was pretty much as far as that movement went. I did appear on CNN to debate Elliot Spitzer, who had a show on those days to defend the repeal amendment. But that's when but that was pretty much the high point of my involvement. Since we didn't have adequate funding to keep that campaign going, and the initiative sort of petered out.
Absolutely. And if I remember correctly, you were also at the 2016 Convention of States Foundation simulated convention that we had in Williamsburg, Virginia. And some of the proposed amendments that you had come up with, I think, were adopted at that convention. Could you describe what your takeaways were after being at that simulation?
Yeah, before I get there, I should say prior to that, I was at an organizational meeting that was held in D.C. At a hotel, the Jefferson Hotel. There, for example, Mark Levin was there, and a whole bunch of other conservative notables from the conservative legal movement were there. And that was the beginning of the Convention of States initiative. That was sort of, and many of us became founding members or founding directors or advisors of the Convention of States initiative from that came out of that meeting. Eventually, Mark Meckler and the others at COS decided to hold this mock convention of the states. I went to it. It was in Williamsburg, and it was very impressive. And I actually learned something from being an observer there. I was an observer. I was also an advisor to some of the task forces. They were committees that were subcommittees that were broken down of the entire convention to work up individual amendments, and I was the advisor to one of those committees, the committee that was considering the repeal amendment, for example, as well as others. And as you say, I think about 3 amendments, some form of which I had proposed in the Bill of Federalism, did get voted out of the convention. But here's the thing that really struck me. I'm a former trial lawyer. I'm a former criminal prosecutor. And there's a certain technique or skill set you acquire in order to be a prosecutor, in order to try cases to juries. I've also argued in the Supreme Court of the United States, and there's a certain skill set that's required in order to do that successfully. I describe both of those in my book, A Life for Liberty. Both my days as a prosecutor, although that's going to be elaborated on in another book, and my experience arguing in the Supreme Court and bringing the constitutional challenge to Obamacare, which is something that I had done. But one thing I noticed from observing the delegates to the convention of this mock convention deliberating is most all of them were experienced state legislators. Now, I never had much of an impression of state legislatures. I didn't know they had a particularly high. I don't have a very high opinion of congressmen and senators, and so my opinion of state legislators is probably no higher than they would be of federal legislators as well. But one of the things I noticed that they had when they spoke to each other, deliberating over the text of these amendments, was they had a way of talking to each other that was very diplomatic. The way they addressed each other, the way they prefaced their comments to each other. And what I noticed, so what I took away from that is they actually had a skill set, a legislator skill set of how they would speak to each other to negotiate text and proposals. And I was really very impressed with the thoughtfulness of their deliberation, as well as the thoughtfulness that went into the modifications of the proposals that I had made. I had worked on the texts of the amendments that I had presented. In fact, the repeal amendment was revised by staff in the House, which did a very nice job of revising the text. But these legislators went to town on the text, and they found, holes or objections that I found quite credible. They modified these provisions in, I thought, very constructive ways. So I have to say, I came away surprisingly impressed with the legislative acumen of state legislators.
It is impressive, and I obviously wasn't at the 2016 simulation, but I was able to attend the one we held last year, or COS Foundation held last year, and had an opportunity to be a part of it. And I was blown away with how serious the legislators took it, even though it was a simulation and wasn't the actual real deal. They treated it that way. But before we continue with that, I should say I kind of buried the lead here and I failed to really adequately give you a proper introduction because of all of the amazing things that you have done. But one of the things, and the reason that we wanted to have you on today, was you just released a new book that you were mentioning, A Life for Liberty, The Making of an American Originalist. And folks, if you want to go on Amazon, you can order the book today. I highly recommend that you do. There we go. We've got a copy of it right there. And so throughout the book, and even in other books that you have written before, Professor Barnett, do you describe your quest to restore what you call the lost Constitution? Could you describe for us exactly what the lost Constitution is that you're looking to restore?
Right. This has sometimes been mischaracterized as an attempt to restore the pre-New Deal constitutional law, what the law of the Supreme Court was before the New Deal. That's not what I have in mind at all. What I have in mind is restoring what I call the lost clauses of the Constitution. And the clauses that I learned were lost when I was a law student at Harvard Law School. And I took constitutional law. I liked the Constitution. I was a patriotic American. I like it like anybody else does. But as I was taking constitutional law, every time I got to one of the good clauses in the Constitution that limited federal power or limited state power or protected our rights, I would turn the page of the textbook or the casebook, and I would see that the Supreme Court had said, well, that provision doesn't apply, or that provision doesn't mean what you think it means. And back in those days, it meant that the Second Amendment didn't really apply to anything. It was, a militia amendment. The Ninth Amendment, which says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage the rights retained by the people, those that are retained by the people. That amendment was basically disparaged and read out of the Constitution. The 10th Amendment was. The Commerce Clause was given an unlimited meaning. The Necessary and Proper Clause was given an unlimited meaning. So what the lost Constitution is restoring all the clauses of the Constitution that aren't there anymore. Oh, here's another one I forgot: the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. Let me recite what that says, and you tell me whether you think that sounds like it should be important. And that says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. And I'm here to tell you that particular provision was gutted by the Supreme Court in 1873, a mere 6 years after it was adopted by the or 5 years after it had been made part of the Constitution. And it's only been used one time to decide a constitutional case in all the years from that day until this day. That is a scandal, a constitutional scandal. And so most of my career as a constitutional law professor has been dedicated to restoring the lost clauses of the Constitution. And by restoring, I mean restoring the original meaning of those clauses, which is why I became a constitutional originalist, which I explain in the book. I explain both how I became one, because I wasn't one originally, and what originalism is and what it has become.
Would you mind, for those who may not know exactly what it means to be an originalist or understanding originalism, would you mind briefly describing what originalism is and why you believe it's so important that we have jurists that practice that belief?
Right. It's a proposition that is so basic and commonsensical. It can be summarized in one sentence. It was essentially the organizing principle of our constitutional republic before there was ever a label called originalism, or even a theory of originalism. It was a practice, and the practice reflects the following proposition: the meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. Let me just say that again, because that's originalism. The meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. Now, of course, there's a lot that goes into this, but it's so commonsensical. We would think the same thing about the meaning of a contract, the meaning of even a private letter. The meanings of all of those documents are fixed when they're published, when they're sent. They have a meaning that's fixed. We use language in order to communicate a fixed meaning. And then constitutional actors ought to follow that meaning. So originalism is a family of theories. I won't go into the details of each one, but it's a family of theories that share two propositions in common. One is called the fixation thesis, which is the meaning of a document like the Constitution is fixed when it is enacted. And that has been enacted at different times in our history. 1789 was the original Constitution. 1791 were the first 10 amendments. 1868 was the 14th Amendment. So it's the meaning those provisions had when they were adopted. That's the first proposition that is originalism. The second is constitutional actors, especially those who take an oath to obey the Constitution, ought to follow the meaning that's fixed in the text of the Constitution. So the first of these claims is a descriptive claim about how language works. Meaning gets fixed in documents when you issue them. And the second is a normative claim about how constitutional actors ought to comport themselves, ought to handle themselves, and that is they ought to respect and follow and adhere to and uphold the original meaning of the text, the meaning that's fixed in the text that they took an oath to uphold.
Yeah, it's fascinating because what you're talking about is the words matter, right? And words as written in a certain context mean something, and yet it seems like increasingly we live in a society where, whether it's right or left, people are trying to ignore the fact that words matter. You see this, for example, in what organizations like the John Birch Society say about what we're trying to accomplish with Convention of States, that we're calling a constitutional convention. And as you mentioned before, it's an amendments convention. And then you see this when you see the left in ignoring things or writing things into the Constitution or reading things into the Constitution. It's crazy that people just want to ignore the context or ignore the original meaning of a document that was written in a certain way for a particular purpose.
Well, it's kind of funny because when I was a young kid, the John Birch Society existed, and it was considered a radical, right-wing kind of conspiracy-minded, anti-communist grassroots organization. It was sort of in disrepute. I thought it went away. I thought it had just kind of ended. But then when I got involved in the Article 5 convention movement and talked to state legislatures, I found out that no, the John Birch Society is still alive and well and kicking at the state level, and they hold a lot of sway over state legislators because there's sort of no one else paying attention to state legislators. State legislators are out on their own. They're trying to do the right thing. They don't want to, they don't want to hassle their constituents. They don't want to be hassled by their constituents either. And these Birch Society members, who are their constituents, they're their voters. They write them and they call them on the phone and they demand certain things. And it's sort of like the path of least resistance is sort of do what they say, because there's really no one on the other side shouting in the other direction.
Absolutely. Now, in the book, you mention in that section where you're talking about the story that you shared with us about the Federalism Amendment, that what really encouraged you about the Tea Party movement was that there was a desire amongst the people to join you in restoring the lost Constitution, but really just a desire to understand the principles of the Constitution, and almost as if the founding era received a bit of a renaissance. And as I was reading that, I realized, well, the Tea Party, that was 2009, was only 15 years ago, and yet it seems like with the language that's been discussed in our current political lexicon, it's abandoned the Constitution. We don't really think about it or discuss it as much as we did back then, or the desire doesn't seem to be there, outside of organizations like perhaps Convention of States. Are you seeing that as well? And what are your thoughts about that?
Right. Well, in the book, I explain, I give you my theory and it's just a hypothesis about what happened to the Tea Party. And I think what happened to the Tea Party was the outcome of the Obamacare case that I was instrumental in bringing. I was the person, as I explained in the book, who devised the argument for why the individual insurance mandate in the Obamacare legislation was unconstitutional. For 1 year, I counseled all of the challengers. I was not one of the lawyers in the cases, but because I had developed the theory and it was published by the Heritage Foundation, I was associated with it. I spent a lot of time talking to the media about it. And so all the lawyers who were litigating these challenges around the country would consult with me about their lawsuits. Eventually, I joined the lawsuit that came out of Florida, the Northern District of Florida, that held that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional, and became one of the lawyers for the National Federation of Independent Business as we went all the way to the Supreme Court. I tell the whole story of that litigation from beginning to end. But as many of your viewers may be old enough to remember, this is all the way back in 2012, we lost that case. Now, we won, in some sense, we won the case. We actually got 5 votes for our theory that the individual insurance mandate, a purchase mandate, was unconstitutional because it was beyond the powers of Congress to enact under its Commerce Clause power or under its Necessary and Proper Clause power. We got 5 votes that it was unconstitutional. Now, normally, if you have 5 votes for your constitutional theory, if you win on the law, that means you've won the case. Well, we didn't win the case. And the reason we didn't win the case was because the 5th vote, Chief Justice Roberts, said that notwithstanding the fact that he agreed that a purchase mandate is unconstitutional, notwithstanding the fact that he agreed that the natural reading of the individual insurance mandate was a mandate, that is, it was a requirement to buy insurance enforced by a penalty, and therefore the natural reading of it is that it was an unconstitutional mandate. He said, because it was fairly possible to interpret or construe the provision as not a mandate, but as an option to buy insurance or pay a non-coercive tax, he could uphold it that way because it was fairly possible. It wasn't the natural reading of the statute, but it was a fairly possible reading of the statute for reasons he gave. He could therefore uphold it, and he even had a duty to uphold it. He had a duty to what he said, defer to the statute, which most of us would say defer to Congress, but he said defer to the statute. And then he upheld it. And in the course of doing so, in that opinion, which I think most all Tea Party members who were completely on our side in that challenge and really had even more confidence we were going to win than I ever had, what he told them was, you need to go off into politics and you need to fight this in the political arena. Don't come to the Supreme Court. Don't come to us. Don't assert your constitutional rights or the limitations of Congress's constitutional powers to us. It's your job to go out in the political process. You want to get your way? That's where you get it. And I think that was the end of the Tea Party movement as a constitutionalist movement. That was 2012. And at that point, they looked around, the people that were angry and agitated by the direction that the country had been taken, who see that we're in a culture war, for example, decided that, the constitutional route was not efficacious. It was not effective. They tried that. And they tried that in a case that they believed was overwhelming, which was the challenge to Obamacare, and they still lost. And as a result of that, they went around and they started to identify a candidate that they thought was just crazy enough to do what the Tea Party type people wanted. The Tea Party people no longer demanding constitutionalism because they got a swift kick in the teeth by the Chief Justice of the United States when they did that. Now they're just demanding political power to get what they believe they're entitled to as American citizens. And the person that they settled on in order to be their champion or their paladin, the one that Chief Justice Roberts told them to go out and find, turned out to be Donald J. Trump. Now, I was working, as the book describes, for a rival candidate, Rand Paul, who is a constitutionalist, and I was a senior advisor to his political campaign, but we got flattened by Donald Trump like all the other candidates did. And I think it's because the people who were the same people who got involved in the Tea Party movement and were trying to pursue it in a constitutional manner, reform in a constitutional manner by restoring the lost Constitution, decided we're going to listen to John Roberts and pursue political power. And they thought of all the people who were standing up there in 2015, vying for the 2016 nomination, they thought Donald Trump was the one that was most likely to do what he promised to do and not just to make empty promises as Republicans had been doing for generations.
Absolutely. There's so many other questions I could ask you about that, but I feel like I'd be remiss And folks, let me just also say that the book, again, is A Life for Liberty. It's available on Amazon. Definitely check it out. It's a book that you're going to want to read. But I feel like, Professor Barnett, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the Biden administration, which is now calling for reforms to the Supreme Court. And I looked this up, and I'm assuming that they're talking about amendments to the Constitution. They weren't very clear in their statement. One, they clearly said that they wanted a constitutional amendment for that no one is above the law. Another, that would impose term limits on the Supreme Court justices, and a binding code of conduct for the Supreme Court. So what are your thoughts about these types of reforms that the Biden administration has proposed?
Well, most of the reforms they're claiming they can do with statutes and not constitutional amendments. And that's very, very problematic, whether they can or cannot do those things. I think they can't do it. And I was actually called as a witness to the presidential commission on the Supreme Court that President Obama formed, President Biden formed, in somewhat to deflect the political pressure that was being placed on him to propose changes to the Supreme Court when he first started his administration. So I was one of the witnesses there. And unlike other law professors, I maintained that most of these reforms were not only bad policy, which they are clearly bad policy and should not be done, and pose a threat to our constitutional republic that is sort of unprecedented in this country. Not only that, I argued they were also unconstitutional. Which is something that most law professors, do not agree with and still do not agree with. And the commission, politely dismissed in a footnote of their final report. But, I've been proven sort of right before that ideas that most constitutional law professors think of as frivolous or marginal, like the fact that an insurance purchase mandate is unconstitutional, turn out to actually have a lot more viability than they predict. And I think this is an argument that would also have some viability, that when you have purely partisan reforms to the changes to this, I hesitate to call them reforms, purely partisan changes to the Supreme Court that are motivated, first of all, it's solely at the behest of one party and solely because that party doesn't like the way the court is ruling, that this is not a proper end of legislation, and therefore it is not a necessary and proper law to effectuate the powers that Congress does have to supervise the Supreme Court and the judiciary itself.
Well, Professor Barnett, thank you again so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. And this has been a great conversation. And again, I can't more highly recommend, folks, that you check out A Life for Liberty, The Making of an American Originalist by Randy Barnett, available on Amazon. Again, Professor Barnett, you've been a true supporter of Convention of States from the very beginning. Thank you so much for everything that you do, and God bless you, sir.
Well, thanks for having me. And all the stuff we talked about is discussed at greater length in the book.
Well, there you have it, folks. And again, you want to check out Amazon for A Life for Liberty, The Making of an American Originalist by Professor Randy Barnett. Just a great, great conversation. I told Producer G after we spoke with him that I had so many more things that I wanted to ask him, but I'm sure we'll have him back. He mentioned that he was going to be writing some other books. He joked that it was going to be a few years, but we hope that he'll be back sooner than that so we can get into that and so much more. But really appreciate having Professor Randy Barnett join us, one of the smartest constitutional attorneys out there and a true supporter of Convention of States. Okay, now let's move on to action at home. Okay, so a few months ago, our comms team announced a competition that was going to be taking place. It was about writing letters to the editor for our grassroots. And then in May, we announced that the winners of that contest were Dallas Zimmerman, Garrett Ringler, and Andrew Shook. So congratulations to them again. But at that time, the comms team said that there was going to be a second phase to the contest, and we announced it a little while ago, and I'm going to announce it again, because from now until the end of August, we're calling upon each state team to publish as many letters to the editor as possible. They can utilize our phase one winners as templates or create entirely original pieces. Just as in phase one, however, these letters should be tailored to your state or locality, tackling topics that resonate with readers while aligning your message, aligning with the Convention of States message. So please note that only published letters related to COS will be counted in this contest. And you can learn more by going to conventionofstates.com/letters contest. And you'll also note in that that the winning state team with the most published letters to the editor will earn an exclusive private dinner with Convention of States president and co-founder Mark Meckler. Now, I'll need to confirm if Mark is picking up the tab, but you don't want to miss out on this chance to have a nice night out with your state team and the COS president. And folks, again, if we're talking about ways that you can take action and make a meaningful contribution to the Convention of States movement from the comfort of your own home, letters to the editor is a huge way to do that, right? You're talking about getting the word out about Convention of States, going into media that perhaps may not otherwise cover things like this. And it's also the way that the founders and the framers talked about what was going on during the founding era, right? Whether it was through things like the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, all of those things were letters to the editor, things that were put out there in the media so people had an understanding of what was going on. And we need to do the same. So this is a simple, easy way for you to make a big contribution to the Convention of States movement. So again, check out conventionofstates.com/letters to the editor, and you'll learn more about that contest and get involved with your state team, right? Go to conventionofstates.com/act to sign up and become a volunteer. I got that wrong. Sorry about that. Producer G just put it up there. It's conventionofstates.com/letters contest. Sorry, not letters to the editor, letters contest, so you can learn more about it. But again, you want to get involved with your state team, go to conventionofstates.com/act. You'll see all of the roles that are available to you, including one that is the state content writer role or perhaps state communications coordinator role. Get involved with your state team, help make these contributions, and who knows, you may have Mark coming out to your state for an exclusive private dinner, and hopefully he'll be picking up the tab. Okay, now it's time for the Minutemen mailbag. I love that singer. All right, so tonight we are going to combine two similar questions and answer both of them. And the first question comes from Bill. And Bill asked, I believe that our Constitution has been under siege for some time now, and I would love to hear what you feel the greatest threat to it is, and probably more importantly, what can we, the people, do about it? Thank you for spending time with us, and you're welcome, Bill. And then Armando wrote in, and he said, upholding the Constitution and Bill of Rights is of the utmost importance to many. How will COS help in this matter? And both of those are some great questions. We've kind of talked about similar things before, but to be honest with you, we could spend an entire hour going through those two questions alone, talking about the threats, the issues, and solutions. But of course, let's start with the obvious answer, right? The obvious answer is joining our movement with Convention of States, helping us build a team of grassroots activists, helping us to engage with our state legislators to pass our resolution, to get to convention. I think, Armando, that would answer your question, because this process and doing what we need to do is upholding the Constitution, because we are using the constitutional method to mend the document, to improve on it. And I know many people would sit there and say, well, hey, wait, the Constitution is perfect as is. And what we really need are people that are just focusing on the actual words in the Constitution and doing what's necessary. I agree with that. And if we had a government that focused on that, sure. But that doesn't mean that you couldn't improve on the document. We love the founders. We love the framers. Some things can be added to that. We have the benefit of hindsight and taking a look back at history and seeing what has happened. There's nothing wrong with adding amendments to the Constitution, and this is the method that the founders or the framers to the Constitution gave us. So that is the way that we can uphold the Constitution and protect the Bill of Rights. But does a convention solve everything? Well, if we had it, I've said this often, if we had a convention tomorrow and had our favorite amendments passed, would everything in our society be solved? And I think if we're being honest, the answer is no. Now, that's not to say we wouldn't be in better shape. I do think if we were able to put some fiscal restraints on the federal government and shrink the scope of the federal government, perhaps getting rid of some departments that in areas where the federal government should not be involved, or putting term limits on bureaucrats, for example, that would make a huge, huge difference, but it wouldn't fix everything. And the reason for that is because, in my opinion, the answer to Bill's question, what is the greatest threat to the Constitution? The answer is apathy and ignorance. Sadly, the greatest threat to the Constitution is we the people. We have not done our jobs within our system of governance. The good news, though, the best part about it, is that it means we are also the solution to the problems, right? The solution lies with you and with me. It's how I sign off every time we conclude COS at Home, as I remind you that we are the solution to the problems that our country faces, right? So if you look at the Constitution, I have it hanging right above me here on my wall. The very first three words are "we the people," right? So unfortunately, we have not done our job. I mentioned, we've kind of forgotten the importance of the document. We haven't been educated on it. We failed in our school systems and teaching this to other generations to understand and respect the Constitution and understand our role within our system. But we can also be the ones to change it and get us back to where we need to go. But in order to do that, it requires that we put in the work. What does that mean? We need to be involved at the local level. I'm talking about school board meetings, town council meetings, board of county commissioner meetings. We need to be fully educated on all of the candidates and participate in primaries. Here in Florida, we've got our primary coming up in 13 days on Tuesday, August 20th. So we need to be knowing what's going on, who's in the race, understanding where they are. You look at even some positions like supervisor of elections, maybe one that doesn't seem to be something you would normally be thinking about. But we need to know who these people are and what it is that they're doing at their job and who we want to support in these primaries and then ultimately in the elections. We need to make sure that we get out there and we vote. But then that's not the end of our job, right? So many people think, hey, I go out and I vote. Some people only vote every 4 years when the president's on the ballot and think that that's it. No, that's crazy, right? You can't just stop there. You then have to go and you have to show up at the state capitol when session is going on. You need to meet with your legislator in their home office. These are the things that we need to be doing. It's not easy. There's a lot of hard work involved, but that is how we're going to be able to turn things around. We didn't get into this mess overnight, and we won't get out of it overnight. But if enough of us are willing to put in that work, show up, stand up, and speak up, we can definitely restore our self-governing culture, save our nation, and preserve liberty for posterity. Again, it's not going to be easy, but it absolutely can be done. And I believe it to my core because I believe in you. And I know that so many of you are out there doing the work that needs to be that needs to be done in order to save our nation. And I'm grateful for it. And that's why, as a regional director and as a member of the Convention of States staff, I do everything I can to serve you out in our communities because I know that you're putting everything you can into this movement to do everything you can to save our country, to restore that self-governing culture that is necessary for us to preserve the liberty for posterity. So thank you for everything that you all are doing. And I want to thank Bill and Armando for writing in. Those were some great, great questions. And again, for all of you watching at home, if you have a question you'd like to see answered, please submit your question by visiting conventionofstates.com/mailbag. We would love to provide you with an answer on a future episode. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to COS Voices. All right, so as I've mentioned, one of the top questions we receive at Convention of States, and I kid you not, there were some people that wrote this in the mailbag, there were some people that were on social media talking about this, so I'm telling you, this is one of the top questions we get. How can I effectively communicate the COS message and do so quickly or succinctly, or how can I just effectively communicate it? Well, thankfully, we've got a long library of activists out in the grassroots that have already demonstrated exactly how to do so. And tonight, we're going to hear from Debbie Rockwell from the free state of Florida.
So Article 5 of our Constitution allows for amendments to be proposed in two ways. The first we're familiar with, Congress. The second is our backup or reserve parachute. In the event that the federal government is overstepping its boundaries, it allows for the majority of the states, in our case 34, to call a convention to propose amendments. And the three we want them to propose are term limits, financial restraints on the federal government, and limiting the scope and power of the federal government. Because the power ultimately belongs to us. So what do you think? Is it time to pull our backup or reserve parachute?
Boom, mic drop. Great job, Debbie. Thank you so much. And wow, folks, we've already concluded our program here for tonight. I can't believe it. We're actually 5 minutes early. I promise I won't filibuster. I'll give you that time back. Just a reminder, all of our COS at Home shows air live on the first Wednesday of every month at 8 p.m. Eastern. So that means our next show will be on Wednesday, September 4th at 8 p.m. Eastern. And I am very, very excited to announce that our guest for the next COS at Home will be none other than Ryan Walters, the Oklahoma State Superintendent of Public Instruction. That means the superintendent of schools there in Oklahoma. He's going to be joining us. Ryan Walters has been doing some amazing work there for education in Oklahoma. I'm really excited to be able to sit down and talk with him. So I hope that you will join us for that. It's going to be a great conversation. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to take a minute to say thank you for everything, all of your support, for being here, allowing us to bring this information to you. It's always a lot of fun, and I hope you've enjoyed this program. Thanks again to Professor Randy Barnett for joining us tonight and being our guest. And a big thanks, as always, to the legend, Producer G, for all of his hard work behind the scenes, including editing down our conversation yesterday and getting it in there today, making it run smooth. We would be lost without Producer G, and I'm just so grateful for him. And of course, the best and greatest thanks goes to all of you who continue to support the Convention of States Article 5 movement. It's important, as I mentioned before, to remember that despite all of the problems that we currently face as a nation, you and I, we the people, we are what? We are the solution. So thank you again. God bless you. Thank you for being in the fight. We'll see you in September. You take care.